Robin Hood Radio and the Robin Hood Radio Network is proud to present Leonard Lopate at Large, lively hour-long in-depth discussions providing overviews and context to topics usually covered in partial measures. His guests include leading thinkers, scientists, artists, economists, farmers, historians, authors, and politicians. Mr. Lopate is a Peabody Award winner whose numerous honors include 3 Associated Press Awards and 3 James Beard Awards.
And welcome to Leonard Lopate at Large. I'm Leonard Lopate. Paul Manafort met on Monday with Special Counsel Robert Mueller's office as part of the cooperation agreement that he made after he pled guilty in a federal court to conspiracy against the United States and conspiring to obstruct justice. As part of the deal, the charges of money laundering and failing to register as a foreign agent for his work on behalf of Ukrainian political parties were dropped. The investigation into Mr. Manafort's lobbying businesses has rattled the lobbying and public relations firms of Washington, D.C. because of its potential to expose illegal foreign efforts facilitated by other groups. In an article last month called Crimea River, the Swampy Business of Lobbying by Foreign Governments, Idrees Kahloon, the U.S. policy correspondent for The Economist, looked deeply into the issue. And just today, we have a new article from Ben Freeman of the Center for International Policy called The Royal Touch. I'm very pleased to welcome both of them to our show. Hi.
Thanks for having me.
Ben, I understand that you recently participated in a forum with Foreign Lobby Watch, which calculates the countries that spend the most by using the semi-annual reports that foreign agents are required to file with the Department of Justice.
Yeah, that's correct. It was a fascinating event.
Now, that's because they have to file under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, FARA. Which countries are the biggest spenders on lobbying?
The biggest spenders are countries like Japan and South Korea, and then you start to get into some of the Middle East countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE. Qatar is also one of the top spenders, in China as well. It's a lot of U.S. allies, but it's also a lot of U.S. sort of frenemies, at best, we might say.
Are campaign contributions included in that amount?
No, but the campaign contributions are included in the supplemental statements, where every 6 months, if you're working on behalf of one of these foreign entities, you have to report all the campaign contributions that your foreign lobbyists, your foreign agents are making. And what we found is that a lot of times those campaign contributions, they go right to the members of Congress that are being contacted on behalf of these foreign powers.
Idrees, according to the watchdog group, the Center for Responsive Politics, it's been over $532 million since 2017?
Yeah, that's right. And they've done the legwork of going through all of the FARA reports and measuring out just how much that is. But again, this is what we're capturing, what is declared. And a big question is what's the amount of unregistered foreign lobbying? And obviously people don't have as good a grasp on it. The problem was that FARA was introduced in the 1930s to combat Nazi propaganda, and it had basically not been used. So from 1966 to 2015, the Department of Justice said that it had only been used about 7 times. Robert Mueller has now charged, I think, something like 16 people using FARA, and we've seen, we've seen registrations under FARA jump up by 50%. So, yes, it's $500 million over 2 years, which sounds like a lot, but we really don't have a sense of how much foreign lobbying is actually happening that's just not being declared.
Now, you mentioned that there have been more cases since 1966 because the law was revised. The focus was shifted from propaganda, which was a major concern in the lead up to World War II and during World War II, to political influence. Is that a subtle distinction?
It's very hard for people to understand what exactly falls under FARA, and it doesn't help that the law is written quite vaguely. There are all kinds of restrictions that could conceivably apply to news organizations. And in fact, the Department of Justice has last year made Russia Today, or RT, register as a foreign agent. Reportedly, Xinhua, the Chinese news agency, is also going to register as a foreign agent. But it's unclear why an organization that's perhaps more reputable, like the BBC, which is also taxpayer funded, would not be made to register under FARA. There are, rules saying that there are exemptions that are given to bona fide academic institutions, bona fide scientists, but it's not clear what exactly that looks like. And because, this has been so seldomly used, there isn't a lot of case law. The Department of Justice had internal advisory opinions, which it kept kind of close at hand and only published in the last couple of years. So we really don't know what exactly falls afoul of FARA, and Robert Mueller is really kind of laying the path out of what doesn't work.
Wasn't Canada once punished for a film in which they talked about nuclear fallout and global warming?
Yeah, this was in the 1980s, and I think that just goes to illustrate how nebulous FARA has been. So there were 3 films that were distributed by the National Film Board of Canada, which talked about the threats of acid rain and nuclear war on the environment, and the DOJ went and labeled it as political propaganda, and this caused a series of litigation that went before the Supreme Court. But, it had been really a sleepy sort of law until recently when Robert Mueller started using it against Paul Manafort and Rick Gates and Maria Butina and several of the Russians who he said were interfering with the American election in 2016.
I'm going to start throwing out questions to both of you because both of you know the answers to all of this. How many FARA cases other than Manafort's have been referred to New York federal prosecutors by Robert Mueller's special counsel? Do we know?
I don't think we know that. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Ben?
I don't think we know the total amount, but we know that it's certainly much more extensive than Manafort. Reports have come out, for instance, that John Podesta, Tony Podesta, who is the brother of John Podesta, whose lobbying firm, actually the Podesta Group, worked with Manafort for a while. It's been reported that...
So that would mean that Democrats and Republicans are involved in this.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. If there's one thing in D.C. that's bipartisan, it's foreign influence.
Wasn't former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn also accused of failing to register as a foreign agent?
Yeah. That was on behalf of Turkey, who was after Fethullah Gulen, who was a cleric who has split with Erdogan, and that got him into trouble. In addition to his talking with the Russian ambassador and lying about it, that also. So yes, this also ensnared Michael Flynn.
And Maria Butina, who had ties to the NRA, has been accused of acting as a foreign agent for Russia, but she isn't guilty of violating FARA. It's something else.
Yeah, this was an interesting. It's an interesting problem with the law. Actually, the Department of Justice, where the FARA unit is housed, they had an audit a couple of years ago, and in the audit pointed out that a lot of FBI agents don't know when or where to apply FARA versus other similar espionage type laws. And Maria Butina's case is actually the perfect example of it. She's performing what would basically look a lot like a violation of FARA, but she's not charged under FARA. She's charged under a similar statute.
Is that because she's not a U.S. citizen?
No. The interesting thing about it is you can charge non-U.S. citizens with FARA violations too. And in fact, some of Mueller's allegations of FARA violations are for Russian citizens before. That wasn't the case for Maria Butina. The charges she's accused of actually carry stiffer penalties. They're more closer to more like espionage activities than FARA is.
Are distinctions made between the impact of lobbying and public relations campaigns?
And when it comes to foreign agents, and this is a great point that Idrees was making, that the law is so incredibly broad and vague about what qualifies somebody to register as a foreign agent. that it does actually include everything from a traditional lobbyist, somebody you think of, who goes into a congressman's office and tries to get him to do something for their client. It covers them, but it also covers more PR type people who are doing more work on information management type stuff, which you wouldn't think of as a lobbyist, but folks like that are still required to register under FARA.
Now, Idrees, you go ahead.
Yeah, one kind of exemption to that is, as I mentioned before, bona fide academic activities. So you have think tanks now that could be said to be performing an operation very similar to public relations. They're putting out research. They may be connecting folks with influential people in Washington who are debating these issues. And because of that exemption that exists in FARA that people don't really know how to apply, or prosecutors haven't really looked at it very seriously, there is kind of this open-ended question about that. So one example are the Confucius Institutes, which are funded by the Chinese government and that exist within universities, and that have been accused by a University of Chicago professor in particular of basically advancing the government line on issues like Tibet and whatnot. And they don't fall afoul of FARA at this point. There are other examples.
Because they just present themselves as an educational organization, teaching language and such?
Yes, exactly. You have similar situations where people have accused, so the Saudi government, for example, is very keen to fund research centers at major American universities, often quite prestigious ones. The line between what they are doing in terms of their educational mission and what would fall afoul of FARA in terms of foreign influence and foreign lobbying is really unclear. So I think that is also worth pointing out, is that where it also doesn't apply.
And Ben's article is all about that, and we'll get to that in a little while. But let's stick with some of these other think tanks. What about a Korean-funded think tank at Johns Hopkins University that was closed in May? Didn't the South Korean government withdraw funds after officials reportedly tried to fire the director over a difference of opinion?
Idrees? and I think that goes to show just how nebulous these kind of interactions are. So there was the U.S. Korea Institute, which was at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in D.C. It's a really respected institution. And it was thought of as not very academically independent, in part because it took funding from the government of Seoul. Now, apparently what happened is that the South Korean officials tried to fire the director and a couple of other officials there, and when the institute would not go along with it, they withdrew the funding, and now the institution has closed. So, whether or not this U.S. Korea Institute should have registered as a foreign agent is really unclear, and it's not something that the law is looking at. And the fact that Paul Manafort has been charged with a violation of FARA has kind of shown a light on all this other stuff that's been going on in Washington for decades, by the way. Ben's kind of been one of the few people who's been working on it, but basically what needs to happen is it's only in moments of kind of crisis or scandal that we actually turn our attention to these kinds of bigger issues.
And I'm speaking with the two men who have written articles about lobbying for foreign governments, Idrees Kahloon and Ben Freeman. This is WBAI New York 99.5 FM. You said that think tanks are generally allowed to operate without having to register as foreign agents, but haven't some prominent think tanks like Brookings and the Center for Strategic and International Studies been embarrassed after it was revealed that they had accepted millions of dollars from foreign governments while they were also producing seemingly objective research on subjects that promoted the interests of those foreign governments?
Yeah, this was a big issue. There was a blockbuster New York Times story that found instances of this, of big foreign governments donating kind of large checks to these institutions. And, at least it seemed like there was some influence going on their reports. And obviously, a Brookings report or a CSIS report carries weight in this town. And that we think is what is attractive to these donors. One thing is that the IRS gets a list of these donors, and they kind of know what the funding streams look like. But those are not really made public. So, one solution to all of this, it's a very complicated problem. One solution is more transparency and the ability to actually see who is donating to these major think tanks.
But I'd imagine it's kind of difficult to discern whether a think tank, a respected one, has actually produced what seems to be objective research, academic work, that actually turns out to be promoting a foreign government's objectives.
It is hard, but it's the same reason that we require an asterisk on scientists who are evaluating drugs who are being paid by pharmaceutical companies, right? Obviously, it's going to be up to the reader to determine whether or not they think that this is objective analysis. But it does help to have that really important context that's there.
And then, go ahead.
I would agree with that, and I would just say that having been worked at a couple think tanks, I think the vast majority of the time, at least in my experience, is that the funding stream doesn't matter, and it doesn't alter the work. But if that's the case, then a think tank should have no problems then with revealing their funding, and they're already filing this paperwork with the IRS to declare where their funding comes from. Just make that funding public, put it out there, and so when that report comes out, like you just said, the public has a right to know that if you're a large think tank and you're putting out a report on Saudi Arabia, for example, that you're also receiving funding from Saudi Arabia, and then let the public judge accordingly.
I want to get back to something that you said earlier, Idrees. I'm going to quote from your article. Rather than pursuing think tanks, the DOJ has focused its attention on government-funded news agencies. After a protracted battle, RT, a television network funded by the Russian government, was made to register as a foreign agent in November 2017. Is this a change in policy that has been brought about through the Trump administration?
Ben might know this better than I, but I don't.
I'm quoting you. That's why.
Yeah. Well, I don't know quite the history, but at least from what I can remember, this was kind of an extraordinary step that the DOJ has taken in making RT register as a news agent. And as I mentioned, they are now reportedly going after Xinhua and another Chinese news agency. But it's unclear what the line is between that and a lot of respected taxpayer-funded institutions, or even in a foreign news agency that's owned by non-Americans, like The Economist, for example, that does try to influence public policy quite directly. Does that fall afoul of FARA? It's unclear.
Al Jazeera wound up been pretty much taken off of cable TV because of concerns along these lines. But it was my sense that the people who were working for Al Jazeera or for RT tried very hard not to look like they were just spouting the official line of the governments that were funding them.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah,
I think that's very true, and I think that for a lot of reasons, it's not clear to me, at least, that Al Jazeera should be registered under FARA. And I think there's a very good case for some of these other organizations, like Xinhua and China Global Television Network, which have both very recently been asked to register under FARA. It's also not a new thing for foreign media to register under FARA. In fact, for more than 30 years, the China Daily has been registered under FARA. South Korea, a media outlet from there, has been registered under FARA. So it's not really necessarily a Trump thing. If anything, it's just more of a general awareness of FARA now, a tightening down.
Ben, do we know the number of unregistered foreign lobbying schemes currently in effect in the United States?
Oh, man, I would pay good money to know that.
Is the FBI the agency that is supposed to keep track of that?
I would say absolutely not. And Idrees and I have talked about this before, and I think, I liken the problem to like just seeing a mouse in your house. If you see a mouse in your house, chances are there's another 3 or 4 probably behind the wall somewhere. In that what we see in FARA really is just the tip of the iceberg. And we've really, the nation has really been awoken to it in these past 2 years with the Manafort case, Michael Flynn, all these other cases that we've mentioned. But I think even that is just, it's just barely the surface of all of the folks out there who are right now in the U.S. operating as unregistered foreign agents.
Well, there's...
Yeah, as Donald Rumsfeld would say, it's an unknown how far down the iceberg goes.
The big loophole is something you mentioned earlier, that the FARA has some exemptions, people such as for people solely engaged in, quote, bona fide religious, scholastic, academic, or scientific pursuits. That can get really hazy, can't it?
Oh, yeah, and in a hurry. Like Idrees was talking about with think tanks, if a think tank is doing, bona fide scholastic research, well, then that's great. But what happens when that person at that think tank is largely being funded by that foreign government? Well, to keep that funding coming, they might write something favorable about that country, or as we've seen with some of the examples of the Confucius Institutes, they simply just they omit some of the bad stuff that China's doing. It's not they're not necessarily lying in those cases. You're just not getting the full truth out of them. But in all those cases, they were still at least claiming that they were qualifying for these exemptions of being bona fide scholastic activities.
What about when a group like Falun Gong, a religious group, does performances that are critical of the Chinese government? Is that just covered by the First Amendment? That
would largely depend on if they were U.S. citizens or not. You get into some of the other minutiae of FARA, which is also very complicated. But that would depend on who was performing that work. Were they a U.S. citizen? Were they doing it in the U.S.? Were they trying to influence policy? Those sorts of things. But I will say that there are plenty of examples of religious entities who have registered under FARA in the past. And one of my favorite examples to tell people about when I'm trying to convince folks that not the foreign agent label shouldn't be, it's not a scarlet letter. It shouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. And the perfect example of that is the Dalai Lama for years was a registered foreign agent in the U.S. Because the Dalai Lama would come here and he would try to raise funds here in the U.S. And that's another thing that triggers FARA registration. So it's important to remember when we're talking about foreign agents, somebody registering as a foreign agent, it's not a taboo. It shouldn't be a scarlet letter.
And it can get kind of complicated if you're talking about the Vatican, for example.
Exactly.
So is the Dalai Lama, is he exempt finally from being prosecuted?
No.
Would he have a certain line that he would have to cross?
There's a criteria in the FARA statute about coming here coming to the U.S. to raise money, and that's really what triggered the exiled government of Tibet and the Dalai Lama to register. I checked recently, and the Dalai Lama is no longer an active foreign agent, but I'm not sure why. I'll dig into it though.
If I were somebody who was involved in the government on some level, how much would I be aware of this underground or unregistered foreign lobbying effort? These various efforts, are these things that I might know about that maybe others wouldn't know about because I was invited to dinner or somebody came to my office?
Yeah, I think it can be quite nebulous. If you go to, a dinner at a swanky Georgetown restaurant that's hosted by a think tank that hews closely to the line of a country, in the Middle East, say, then there is going to be some level of influence that's going to be imparted, whether or not you're cognizant that this is some kind of unregistered foreign lobbying scheme that's unfolding before you is, that might not happen. But I think that if you are certainly in a position to rule on an issue that's dear to some of these countries, then you're going to encounter this, right? All these countries have policy objectives, and they will look for a way to influence.
As a result of Mueller's investigations, are Washington lobbyists being more careful about whether they should be registered as foreign agents?
Yeah, so we've seen registrations under FARA jump up for the first time. I think they're up something like 50% year over year. In the 90s, registration had really dropped off, one, because of a legal change, and two, because, the FARA unit at the DOJ did not really pursue violations very aggressively. In fact, their MO was really to warn lobbyists about a violation rather than attempt and charge them. So it does seem like, lobbyists and people who might potentially fall under FARA are becoming more skittish about that. Now, generally, to talk about domestic lobbying very quickly, what we have seen is an increase in the amount of lobbying that's going on and a decrease in the number of registered lobbyists. So that suggests that maybe there is lots of money that's being poured in, and there are folks that are not registering under, the domestic lobbying statute. And I don't think that has reversed, but I think around the foreign lobbying issue, then people are in fact becoming a bit more aware of the possible prosecution that they risk for not registering.
Doesn't FARA? You wanted to add something?
Yeah, please. I completely agree with all of that, and I think one of the reasons why you may see a drop in on the domestic lobbying side and an increase on the FARA side is that FARA actually include the policy change that Idrees mentioned happened in the 90s as part of the Lobbying Disclosure Act. And what it basically did was it said that if you were a foreign business and you had hired a lobbying or PR firm here to represent you, so long as you were registered under the LDA and, again, performing just purely bona fide commercial activities, that you could register under the much less stringent reporting requirements of the LDA and not have to register under FARA. And a lot of folks, this is a so-called LDA exemption or commercial exemption.
LDA standing for?
Lobbying Disclosure Act exemption. And a lot of firms for a long time, we had suspected that they were taking advantage of this and registering under the LDA when they should have been registered under FARA. And so with this new heightened focus on FARA in this, focus by Mueller's team, I think a lot of those firms are now finally crossing over and saying, you know what, you're right, we should be registered under FARA and not the LDA.
And where...
Go ahead.
Right, and just very quickly, where this all becomes tricky is that, in countries like Russia or Saudi Arabia, there are a lot of very big companies, places like Gazprom or Aramco or maybe the Venezuelan state oil company, where, what is just the corporate interest and what is the governmental interest is very unclear. So if you're able to register under LDA as a lobbyist for Gazprom and not under FARA as a lobbyist or foreign aid, on behalf of the Russian government, then that presents a problem. So I think that is also kind of a clear reason why this is such a salient issue.
Doesn't the original FARA legislation from 1938 explicitly mention typewriters, parchment paper, and the copying press?
Yes, it does.
Why hasn't anybody suggested updating it a bit to include some advances in technology and techniques? In fact, pretty much all the ones that we talk about these days, using the social media, for example.
Yeah, I'll tell you, Leonard, we're trying, and that's the thing about, a statute from 1938 in the digital age. Like, forget Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and all this other stuff. I mean, a lot of people back then weren't even watching TV. And so thinking about influence, taking an influence law from that time and trying to apply it to today, it's really no surprise that what happened in the 2016 election happened, because the nation pretty much turned a blind eye to foreign influence for almost 70 years. And if we're going to, in the elections going forward, if we're actually going to address foreign influence on these social media platforms, we can't just rely, on Facebook or on Twitter to do the right thing when it comes to these folks. We've got to have real legislation that increases transparency about the foreign influence on these platforms.
You're listening.
And,
go ahead.
Sorry, and just to quickly chime in, it's not just FARA that's outdated. Our entire campaign finance supervision architecture was, built in the 70s, and someone in kind of the early 2000s, it really does not contemplate the importance of digital advertising to modern campaigns. And there have been attempts in the aftermath of the 2016 election, like Senator Mark Warner's Honest Ads Act, to try and update, our federal campaign finance system. But, basically in all of the major pieces of legislation that are supposed to shield American elections from foreign influence look kind of as outdated as talking about parchment and lithography.
But I assume that some of the resistance to changing things is the result of campaign contributions to the people who have to vote on laws like that.
Yeah, it might be.
Idrees Kahloon, whose article "Crimea a River." I'm forgiving you the pun. The swampy business of lobbying for foreign governments appeared in The Economist last month, and Ben Freeman. By the way, Idrees Kahloon is the U.S. policy correspondent for The Economist. Ben Freeman of the Center for International Policy. His article is called "The Royal Touch" and addresses the influence, the lobbying efforts of Saudi Arabia, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But Idrees, what do governments who spend money through lobbying efforts hope to get in return for their investments?
There are all sorts of things. The avoidance of sanctions, the continuance of favorable foreign policy towards them. Ben's article talks a lot about, Saudi Arabia's influence game and their desire to keep up their military intervention in Yemen. There are all sorts of things that are really relevant to these foreign governments that they have an interest in trying to influence.
And you look into some of Paul Manafort's illegal lobbying efforts in your article. Were they simply illegal because he'd failed to register as a foreign agent?
It seems like more than that. I mean, there was kind of millions of dollars that were flowing in to the country on behalf of Viktor Yanukovych, who was the pro-Russian prime minister of Ukraine at the time. It was stuff like a smear campaign against Yulia Tymoshenko, who was an opposition figure, and
who he threw in jail, who he threw into prison.
Yes, they threw her in prison, and Manafort, I believe, suggested, or at least it's alleged in the statement from Mueller, that he helped fan rumors that she had a political opponent murdered. There are all sorts of things that were wrong that were going on there. And I think one thing to keep in mind with FARA is that even though it's quite nebulous, we're pretty clear that from what's been alleged about what Paul Manafort did, that should fall afoul of FARA. What is murky is all the stuff that's kind of in the middle and goes kind of unregistered, undeclared, and kind of unprosecuted from the federal government's perspective.
And they can lobby at a pretty high level. Didn't they lobby Barack Obama and Joe Biden in the Oval Office?
Yeah, that was one kind of interesting detail that emerged from Mueller's findings, that Paul Manafort had assembled a group that he called a Habsburg group, which was made up of 4 former heads of state in Europe. So these were high-level folks who he recruited as part of this multi-million-dollar influence campaign on behalf of Ukraine, all of which went unregistered. One portion of kind of added criminality that the Mueller investigation found is that he didn't declare taxes on, the proceeds that he got from this. So, kind of even exempting FARA altogether, there are all sorts of issues with what Manafort seems to have done.
And isn't the way the money was paid to Manafort a matter of concern? How was he paid?
Yeah, it was. I think we just went through bank accounts, and he used that as he kind of misled, 1, tax authorities, and 2, banks. And there's kind of another series. So there was 1 prosecution of Manafort on the financial stuff alone, and then a second set of allegations around FARA violations.
Now, why would he even try to get around them if he had just simply registered them in a legal way? Wouldn't he have been just as effective? Was it a matter of him trying to skim some money off the top?
I think this goes back to what Ben Freeman was saying, which is that being registered as a foreign agent is perceived as a scarlet letter, and it's one reason why we think that think tanks might be attractive, because it's kind of influence laundering in a way. A lobbyist in your office doesn't get quite the same amount of authority because he's being paid to say whatever he's going to say, as opposed to an objective seeming research paper that's provided to you. So I think that might have something to do with it as well.
And Ben, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with what Idrees said, and I think another thing too is that the level of disclosure required for FARA registration is not it's not desirable for some folks who are working with unsavory clients like Manafort was, and they're really the exception in FARA registrants. The Manafort. I often tell people that Manafort really is an anomaly in FARA. Most FARA registrants, they're completely innocuous. Like I mentioned, Japan and South Korea, being the biggest spenders when it comes to FARA, but the vast majority of what they're doing is economic spending. And so what Manafort is doing, and what he had done before, he had worked with other dictators before. So a lot of folks who are working for dictators, they don't want to disclose that they're working for them. There's reputational costs. People don't want to work with a guy who's working with dictators. And there's folks who are working with dictators, they don't want to disclose the types of lobbying that they're doing. FARA requires you to disclose what are called informational materials, which is a nice word for propaganda. And you have to disclose copies of anything that you distribute on behalf of that foreign client. And when you're distributing propaganda on behalf of a dictator, you might not want a lot of people to see that propaganda.
And we're talking about a lot of money. $532 million is the amount over the course of a year in foreign lobbying that was registered. And then some experts believe the amount of unregistered foreign lobbying coming into the U.S. is at least twice as large. That would be over $1 billion.
Yeah, that's kind of the most conservative estimate, right? If you ask a couple of people who work on this, then among them, they say that they don't have a clue, how far down it goes, but twice as much is kind of the most conservative estimate that I've seen, and we really don't have a sense of how much is going on, especially if you think about those nebulous cases of think tanks, educational institutes. If we start counting news agencies that are funded by foreign governments as well, then you can quickly see how that $500 million could start to look pretty small in comparison.
Idrees, you begin your article with the legal woes of Nisa Chowdhury, a 71-year-old who's a Pakistani national living in Maryland. What led to his legal woes?
So that was kind of an interesting case. He created this organization called the Pakistan American League, and he was self-appointed as the president there. And it turned out prosecutors said that he was basically trying to influence American lawmakers on behalf of the Pakistani government. And so he was charged with FARA. It was kind of a rare sort of crime. And it's only notable really because Paul Manafort has been charged with it as well, as including kind of Michael Flynn and all the folks in the Trump administration. So he is kind of just an example of maybe stepped up in monitoring.
Well, doesn't this become complicated when a country like Pakistan is considered a friend of the United States, or Saudi Arabia is considered a friend of the United States?
Yeah, this goes back to what Ben was saying about lots of these countries being frenemies with the United States. This stuff does get very, very complicated, and it's unclear what the government should do. I mean, there's not much effort on Congress's part to really reform FARA and try to bring it up to the 21st century and address issues like Twitter bots or foreign interference that's wandered through Facebook or other social media networks.
Ben, your article is called The Royal Touch, How Saudi Money Keeps Washington at War in Yemen. The United States is playing a role in the war in Yemen on the Saudi side?
Yeah, and it's actually a much more active role than I think a lot of people are aware of. We provide military support to the Saudis. We help them with some targeting on their strikes. We also help them with aerial refueling for some of their airstrikes in Yemen. And perhaps even more importantly than that, we sell them a lot of the bombs and military equipment that they're using to conduct these airstrikes in Yemen. And so even though the U.S. doesn't have boots on the ground in Yemen or anything like that, the U.S. military, at least de facto, is playing an active role in the Yemen war.
And how long has this been going on? Does this predate the Trump administration?
Yeah, it actually started the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen started under the Obama administration, actually, and we were, and again, it's not a bipartisan issue. The Obama administration was allowing this to happen, was allowing American-made bombs to flow to the Saudis that ultimately killed civilians in Yemen, and the Trump administration has only continued that.
And you mentioned some prominent names in this. Mark Lampkin is one. Surprisingly, Trent Lott.
Yeah.
And then the McKeon Group named after somebody who used to be in Congress?
Yeah, it's really when you start digging into the Saudi lobby like we did, and in a nutshell, what our project was, we took the Saudi lobby for 2017 and we said, let's just look at one of these countries 1 year, but let's look at everything. So we looked at every single lobbyist they had, every single firm they had hired, and there were over 24 firms they had hired. And we created a database of every single political activity that they did. So we could tell you not only was Trent Lott working for him or somebody like Howard Buck McKeon, we could tell you exactly what they were doing and on which days they were doing it and on which members they were talking to on a given day.
And I'm quoting from your article. This is what you wrote. According to a forthcoming report by the Foreign Influence Transparency Initiative program, which I direct at the Center for the International Policy, registered foreign agents working on behalf of interests in Saudi Arabia contacted congressional representatives, the White House, the media, and figures at influential think tanks more than 2,500 times in 2017 alone. In the process, they also managed to contribute nearly $400,000 to the political coffers of senators and House members as they urged them to support the Saudis. Some of these contributions, like Lampkin's, were given on the same day the requests were made to support those arms sales. That sounds like a quid pro quo to me.
Yeah, this was an interesting finding that we had, and Lampkin wasn't alone. We actually, I point out that example, and I talk about Lampkin by name, but we actually found 10 other examples just like that, where on the very same day, a lobbyist who's working for Saudi Arabia goes into a congressional office, and that same day, somebody from their lobbying firm makes a campaign contribution to that same person. The thing, it looks a lot like quid pro quo, and, some people might say it looks a lot like bribery, but the thing about it is, and this gets back to our point about laws being outdated, is that it's perfectly legal. What they did is absolutely perfectly legal. It's illegal for a foreign national to make a campaign contribution in the U.S., so the Saudi government can't directly donate to anybody's specific campaign, but there's an easy workaround. Just hire a D.C. lobbying or public relations firm, pay them handsomely, and then the American citizens at those firms, they can make campaign contributions to anybody they want to, even if it's to a member of Congress that they are talking to that same day.
Hasn't there been a lot of talk about eliminating the revolving door between people who have served in Congress and then go into lobbying firms?
I think that our laws are vulnerable even if you tighten up those requirements. What Ben mentioned about, as long as Saudi Arabia or another country is not directly saying, lobby this guy, give a campaign contribution to this guy, this kind of system would work. And we also have expanded the kinds of organizations that could be politically active. We have 501c4s, which are public interest groups that can be politically active. You can establish complicated chains between a corporation in Delaware, a 501c3, which is a nonprofit, and then a 501c4, which then starts pushing out ads. And a lot of this would not have to go through the Federal Election Commission. It wouldn't have to be disclosed to them. This would get disclosed to the IRS. but the IRS is unlikely to pursue this kind of thing. So, tightening up the revolving door for lobbyists might be good for other public policy objectives. But if your goal is to try and limit the possible influence of foreign money on American elections, then there are lots of other holes that need to be plugged as well.
Ben, I was wondering whether this effort by the Saudi government is the reason we've been hearing about things like women finally being allowed to drive in Saudi Arabia.
Oh, absolutely. A big part of the Saudi, lobbying machine is actually not lobbying; it's public relations. And a big chunk of the activity that we found, over 500 different recorded activities from them, were all PR related, where they were reaching out to mainstream media outlets, including, Idrees, they were even reaching out to the Economist. But many others too, and they're trying to get favorable news stories written. And when they do have an event like women driving or opening a movie theater in Saudi Arabia, they're very actively sending out press releases and trying to get press coverage for that, while stymieing as much as possible any press coverage about civilian casualties in Yemen or any of the very real human rights issues that Saudi Arabia still has going.
You reveal that. Go ahead, Idrees.
I'll just add in. Yes, Saudi Arabia has been on a big PR push around allowing women to drive for the first time around Vision 2030, which is Mohammed bin Salman's attempt to revitalize the Saudi economy. And at the same time, there is a lot going on in Yemen. There's a lot going on in terms of freedom of expression within Saudi Arabia itself. So on the day that women were first allowed to drive, a lot of the women who had spearheaded the movement were in jail and weren't available for media to interview, including when the Economist went to Saudi Arabia. And just 2 days ago, a Saudi kind of journalist who was in self-exile in Washington, D.C., was in Turkey trying to get a marriage pass certificate, and he disappeared. And this was a guy that I interviewed just a couple of months before. This is kind of a huge new scandal, and we don't know exactly what happened, but there are all sorts of unsavory things that are going on at the same time, and I just wanted to mention those.
Yeah.
Are certain members of Congress targeted more than others? You mentioned that Lindsey Graham was the most contacted.
Yeah, Lindsey Graham's the most contacted, and it sort of makes sense. He very much fits the prototype of the members that the Saudis do focus on, and not just the Saudis, but a lot of the foreign lobbies focus on members of the Foreign Affairs, Foreign Relations committees, and also the Armed Services committees. Lindsey Graham is a longtime member of the Senate Armed Services Committee. He's also on the very powerful Appropriations Committee, too, which is responsible for actually doling out the money from Congress. And so what you see when you look at the activity of these lobbyists is they're certainly not stupid. They're very astute folks who are very good at this, and so they'll focus their work on those members of Congress most likely to be able to get the stuff done that their foreign clients need to get done. And so you see this disproportionate focus on Lindsey Graham. On the Democratic side, it was Chris Coons. And again, it's very bipartisan. There's not, they're not just talking to Republicans. They're not just talking to Democrats. They're talking to both sides to try and get done what their foreign clients want to get done.
You say that Saudi money, you mentioned earlier, goes to think tanks like the Arab Gulf States Institute, the Middle East Institute, and the Center for Strategic and International Studies. But a lot of it, not just from the Saudis, but from a number of these countries, goes to elite universities. What do they hope to gain by giving money to the elite universities? Idrees?
I think this would just to tack on to what you just said before. I think what they're trying to gain is sway over the research coming out of those universities.
And Ben, has it been effective in the case of the Saudis? Because I would think that there's a certain amount of suspicion of Saudi motives in academic circles.
There is and there isn't, and the interesting thing for them is that, and then this again to a point you just made earlier, is that a lot of this influence isn't really, it's not known, and so when the Saudis or the Chinese or any foreign power, they're donating to a university, it's not often clear that the piece of research that you're reading or the lecture that you're hearing is actually being funded by a foreign power. You think, well, I'm just on an Ivy League university, I'm hearing the truth, which may be true to a certain extent, but at the very least, you're hearing the truth through the filter of foreign money.
Now, in the few moments we have left, if I decided that I wanted to be a lobbyist for a foreign power, what would I have to do under FARA or any other regulations? I need to make a little extra money. I'm working in public radio.
Well, the interesting thing is you wouldn't have to do much. Well, number one, you'd want to get an affluent foreign client. If you want to make some money outside of the air. Get an affluent foreign client, and set up a contract with them, and then within 10 days you'd have to, once you made that agreement with them, you'd have to register with the FARA registration unit. And the initial filing is very basic. It's just the information about you'd have to include your contract if you had one, but it's just who you are, who your foreign client is. And then every 6 months you would file what's called a supplemental statement. And that's the one where you have to file a lot more information, like all those campaign contributions I mentioned, and also all that, any political activity you did for them. You'd have to report everything you did in that 6-month period. And you'd have to keep doing that every 6 months until you stopped working for them.
Idrees Kahloon's article in The Economist is Crimea River, a swampy business of lobbying for foreign governments. And Ben Freeman's article is The Royal Touch. And my great thanks to both of you for being on our show today.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
And that brings us to the end of our show. My great thanks to Idrees Kahloon and Ben Freeman, to Angela Sheldon, who produced today's segment, to Charlie Morrow, who composed our opening theme, to Reggie Johnson, who was at the audio controls, and to my assistant producer, Jesse Lent, who makes things run smoothly. Leonard Lopate at Large comes to you on Saturdays at 4 and Tuesdays at noon. You can subscribe to Leonard Lopate at Large podcast on iTunes and by clicking on Robin Hood Radio's archive program site, which is robinhoodradio.com. You can also check out Leonard Lopate at Large Facebook page. We hope to see you next week.